Hey, it's your guy Tyrrell back with the interviews. In today's video, we're going to briefly analyze the main tactical themes in Arsenal's 2-1 win over Fulham. So in today's video, first we're going to focus on Fulham's shape, then we'll analyze how both sides look to press, and lastly we'll focus on Arteta's system change in the second half. So when we break it all down and we do look at the board, we have both sides starting the game in a 4-2-3-1. So when we analyze how they look to approach the game out of possession, it was fairly similar. When you look to Fulham, they were dropping off into two banks of four, but in terms of their pressing, they always ensured that they had pressure on the center back on the ball, and it was often Mitrovic shifting towards Gabriel and Saliba. And then in that midfield zone, it was 3v3 as expected. Andreas Pereira would sit on elneny, and at times they would drop off into those two banks of four, and they'd have Mitrovic and the center attacking midfielder in between elneny. From there, it's supposed to be Reed stepping towards Xhaka, and then Joao Palhinha dealing with Odegaard. In any case, even if they had Andreas Pereira stepping towards the center back on the ball, Mitrovic would drop off deeper to sit it on elneny. If they dropped off into the two banks of four, then they'd have both of those attacking players sitting in between elneny, and then from there you would see Xhaka and Odegaard in the pockets of space between the central midfielder and the wide player looking to push forward. There were no real surprises on how Arsenal operated on the left-hand side. In the earlier stages, you'd see Martinelli shifting into the gap between Tete and Adebayo, and Tierney would push beyond Decador Reed. From there, Xhaka would drop off in towards the half space, but as you could see, Fulham would be capable of dealing with that threat because they could simply have the wide player pushing to Xhaka, have Tete dealing with Tierney, and then a center back dealing with Martinelli. The other alternative there would be to have Tierney sitting narrow. You'd see Xhaka shifting out to the wide area, and Martinelli was dropping in towards that gap. And if that wasn't the case, you'd have Martinelli hugging the touchline, Xhaka pushing forward into that gap between the center back and the fullback, and Tierney adopting a narrow position. And as that game continued, you would eventually see Tierney drifting laterally in towards that midfield zone, officially creating a 3-2-5. But even in those scenarios, they simply had Reed stepping towards Tierney, and then from there, they could have Decador Reed applying pressure towards Gabriel if he pushed forward, or simply dropping off deeper to protect Tete against Martinelli and have the center back dealing with Xhaka. Whereas on the right-hand side, you also ended up seeing Odegaard dropping off into that gap between Cabano and Joao Palhinha. But what ended up happening there was that when he looked to get on the ball, Joao Palhinha would step towards him to apply pressure. That would then force him to shift out towards the touchline zone, but that would force Saka into more narrow positions. If they want to get Saka on the ball from that touchline position, you'd end up seeing Odegaard checking in towards the ball and then sprinting forward beyond Joao Palhinha and Cabano to occupy Ream. However, when Odegaard looked to shift away from Palhinha and looked to receive the ball between the lines, we ended up seeing Fulham adopt an approach that we witnessed from Wolves last season, where they had Joao Palhinha and Cabano blocking off the passing lane in towards Odegaard to ensure that he couldn't receive the ball in that tight space to facilitate it into the path of Gabriel Jesus or Saka. In many ways, Fulham's defensive approach was successful, and it limited Arsenal's ability to create chances from open play. In the build-up to Fulham's goal, you witnessed Odegaard, White, and Saka being closed down, and it forces Saka to switch the ball out to Gabriel. You see Mitrovic leaving Saliba and shifting his attention to the center back on the ball, and he has no outlet pushing forward. You see Tierney being closed down, elneny closed down by Andreas Pereira, and Xhaka closed down by Reed, and that results in Mitrovic stepping into Gabriel, applying pressure, winning possession, brushing him off the ball, and then breaking forward in towards the Arsenal penalty area. And despite Gabriel's pressure from behind, here you see Mitrovic beating Ramsdale in the 1v1. When you look at their best chances, it often stemmed in transition, where they were able to get Saka running in behind Robinson or Ream, or simply finding the ball in between the lines and then carrying it forward to link play with his teammates. Whereas when you look to Arsenal's pressing, it was somewhat similar. They had Gabriel Jesus and Odegaard leading the line, and what you ended up seeing here was that Odegaard would often sit on the deepest midfielder in Joao Palhinha. Gabriel Jesus was leading the press, and if at times you had Odegaard stepping towards a center back, he'd block off the passing lane in towards the midfielder. You'd have elneny tracking the movement of Pereira, and then you would have Xhaka sitting on Reed, but there were occasions where Mitrovic was dropping in towards that midfield zone, and Xhaka would sit near him. And if Reed looked to push forward, that's where you needed Martinelli to shift over. But on several occasions, if Reed looked to push forward, because Mitrovic dropped off into that midfield zone, one of the center backs were capable of picking him up to ensure that Fulham couldn't bypass that Arsenal press press on a consistent basis. You had the wide players closing the fullbacks, you had White and Tierney dealing with the wide players, and from there, with Odegaard and Gabriel Jesus leading the line, they ensured that Fulham couldn't play through that midfield zone, and Xhaka was aware of Mitrovic dropping off in towards that central area if the center backs didn't follow him. Therefore, when you shift to the second half and you break down how Arsenal were able to get into better positions, initially in the early stages, what you ended up witnessing was more of Tierney drifting into that central midfield zone and Xhaka and Martinelli swapping positions, whether it be in the gap between the fullback and the center backs and out in the wide areas. But Arsenal were also going long to try to get the ball into Saka by having Saliba or White pushing forward and clipping it over Cabano to get Saka into 1v1s with Robinson. While he struggled to get the better of the fullback for large spells of this game, that ultimately resulted in a shift from Arsenal following Mitrovic's opener. It ended up seeing Arteta bring on Nketiah for Tierney, and from there Arsenal now had two center forwards, and they looked like more of a 3-1-4-2 in the early stages because they had Martinelli and Saka out in the wider areas. Xhaka and Odegaard were pushing forward beyond elneny, who was sitting just ahead of the center backs. You had elneny sitting just ahead of the back line, and then Gabriel Jesus and Nketiah occupying the center backs. Essentially, that meant that one of Martinelli or Saka, depending who played on the left-hand side, would have to drop off into a fullback position at a possession, and that's where we often saw Arsenal drop off into more of a 4-5-1. But in attack, like I said, while it would be more of a 3-1-4-2 or a 3-4-1-2, you'd end up seeing Arsenal basically attack with 6 attacking players, and they were more of a 3-1-6 when they applied pressure, and at times you even had a White pushing forward on the overlap in advanced wide positions. With Gabriel Jesus and Nketiah occupying the center backs, they were now spinning in towards the half spaces to receive the ball and looking to play pullbacks or break towards goal to harm Leno. The reason why they were able to do that was because the wide players were hugging the touchline, drawing away the fullbacks, and that created space for the forwards to make the runs in towards that zone. The other key attribute of having Nketiah and Gabriel Jesus up front was that one of them was often dropping off in towards that midfield zone to try and create an overload, and then the other one was looking to spin in behind to drag back the center backs to ensure that they couldn't follow the forward dropping in towards that midfield area. The other key theme here was that Odegaard was now dropping off in towards that midfield zone to get on the ball either ahead of the midfield bank or in between the lines, and from there you could pick out the runs of Gabriel Jesus and Nketiah breaking beyond the center backs to get into 1v1 situations. Like I said, there were occasions where it did look like more of a 3-2-1-4 as Xhaka dropped off into deeper positions near elneny to help Arsenal build attacks from deeper positions, but there were occasions where he was pushing forward into the gap between the center back and the fullback to help stretch the pitch for Martinelli. In this example, you witness Jesus leading the break with Martinelli occupying Tete, and he slides the ball into the path of Xhaka breaking into left half space. Xhaka's touch is a tad bit heavy, and it forces him to pull the ball back into the path of Jesus breaking free into the penalty area. He takes a good first touch, and from here you're expecting him to get a shot on goal, but he adjusts his body and opens it up with his right foot, and he allows the defender to close him down, and he fires a tame effort at the keeper. There was even a period where Arteta swapped the positions of Martinelli and Saka to have them operate as direct wingers to break towards the byline to try and provide service for Nketiah and Gabriel Jesus in that penalty area. Ultimately, there were two key areas that helped Arsenal scrape by Fulham in this game following their tactical shift. One was the positioning of the two central forwards that dropped back the back line and helped Odegaard and Saka get more space on the ball, and that was prevalent for their opening goal. And then following like-for-like changes for Fulham as they didn't really shift their system, the introduction of Mbabu presented an area for Arsenal to exploit as they were using the movement of Martinelli and Nketiah to get across and behind the fullback, and ultimately when they got into those positions they created legitimate goal-scoring chances. And in the build-up to the corner that resulted in Arsenal's winner, you could see that's Martinelli looking to take on the fullback, isolate him, and have success against him to break in behind to win the corner, and that often wasn't seen against Tete throughout the game. So as you could see, Marco Silva's initial approach presented issues for Arsenal in terms of creating legitimate goal-scoring opportunities on a consistent basis, but Mikel Arteta deserves credit here for altering the system immediately and targeting Fulham's right side in the latter stages of the game.